Here we're talking about access. If you don't have access, you're not going to be a very effective reporter. And if you don't have access, you're not going to be a very informed citizen, which means that without access, democracy is jeopardized. You should understand that the First Amendment does not give you a right of access to places. In fact, there is no constitutional right of access, with the one exception of access to public trials under the Sixth Amendment. And there is no First Amendment obligation for the federal government or the state government or anybody to be open and give you what you want to know. On the other hand, since we don't have a First Amendment right, we have had to turn to statutes to protect the public's right to know. And the most important that we deal with on a national level is the Freedom of Information Act, also known as FOIA. FOIA is a federal statute. It does not apply in the states. In other words, if you make a FOIA request for the California Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco Controls, they will laugh you out of the room. FOIA also applies only to federal executive agencies. And it kind of makes sense because executive agencies are the ones that run things for us. FOIA does not apply to the legislative branch, and FOIA definitely does not apply to the judicial branch. FOIA, it was written with a presumption of openness. In fact, the law was signed into being by President Lyndon Johnson back in the 1960s. And FOIA generally provides that anybody can have access to federal executive agency records, with the caveat that there are exemptions under the Act. There are online guides to information which will be helpful to you. I suggest that you copy down these. WWW Justice is the Justice Department's guide. Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press also has a guide to using FOIA. It's also good. The Reporters Committee does a fair amount of litigation for openness. And here's how FOIA works. First thing is you identify the documents you need, or the information that you need. If you don't know what you want, it's hard to ask the federal government to give it up to you. Second, you have to determine who has the documents, and that's not always easy. It used to be in the bad old days that if you sent a FOIA request into an agency and the agency didn't have control of the records, they would simply ignore you and you'd be sitting around wondering what happened to your request. Agencies today are supposed to work with you to help you locate which agency has the record to be able to help you find it. Third, you write a letter. Both the Justice Department and Reporters Committee websites have sample letters. Follow them to get the information. And here's something I suggest. Every time you make a request under FOIA, or later on under the California Public Records Act, make the request in your name and also make me one of the requesters. That helps save time in the event that I have to sue somebody. You send the letter, hoping that you found the right agency, and then you wait for a response. Agencies have 20 working days, that is to say they don't count holidays or weekends. Then you get the documents, or you don't. If you don't get a response, contact the agency. If you're denied, you look at the exemption or exemptions that are cited and the rationale or rationales given, and then you call me. And we see what we can do. Also, see your boss. Your boss will talk to his or her boss, and whoever you're working for will decide whether or not they want to sue over the documents, which is number 11. See, we have a top 10 list and ours goes to 11. FOIA suits. Here's what happens. You will sue in the federal district court where you reside, or the federal district court where the records are held, or the federal district court in Washington, D.C., which is the seat of every federal executive agency. So in each setting, there is jurisdiction. The trial court will look at the records. It will look at how the government applied its exemptions and rule one way or the other. Then somebody's going to appeal, and the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals will look at the trial court's ruling on the exemptions. and ultimately the Supreme Court has the last say. Let's go through the non-exemptions. I'm going to read them off, but then we're going to come back and spend a little more time on them, or at least the 7 that are important to us. First is national security. Second, internal personnel rules and practices of an agency. Third, the statutes make these matters exempt from disclosure. Trade secrets, interagency, intra-agency communications, personnel medical records which the disclosure of would constitute a clearly unwarranted invasion of someone's privacy. Then investigatory files can file for law enforcement, agencies that regulate financial institutions, and information about geological and geophysical data. We don't do a whole lot with numbers 8 and 9 because when you're starting out, unless you're in the state that has a lot of oil, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. Exemption number 1, national defense, national security, or foreign policy. Rose versus Department of the Air Force. It's not in your text, but I do like to talk about this. There was a cheating scandal at the Air Force Academy, and Rose wanted to find out what happened. Who was cheating? How were they cheating? What was the result of the cheating investigation? And the Department of the Air Force said, oh no, we can't tell you because it would be a national defense matter if we told you about these Air Force cadets who were cheating on exams. You know, not to mention that the Air Force cadets ultimately would be flying the nuclear-equipped bombers. Having cheated on the exam, I'm not sure how much I would trust them not to press the wrong button. But Rose sued the Department of the Air Force. The case made it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court held that a cheating scandal at a military academy was not a matter of national defense, and the Department of the Air Force was ordered to give up the records. Exemption 2, matters related to internal personnel or practices of an agency. If you work for a federal agency, you may have at your office a parking lot, and there may be rules as to who gets the prime parking spaces and who has to hunt for a space later on in the day. That would be an internal practice in which there was no significant public interest. And FOIA's exemption number 2 makes it clear that such trivial things do not have to be produced. But Hawks versus IRS. Hawks is with a law firm that specializes in tax matters, and Hawks sought from the IRS a copy of its auditing manual. That is to say, that's the document that the IRS agents use when they audit your tax returns. Now, you may not have been audited because you're young, but you may have parents or adult relatives who've been audited by the IRS, and they will tell you uniformly it was not their favorite time ever. The Internal Revenue Service objected to the disclosure of the auditing manual, and they cited exemption number 2, saying, hey, this is internal stuff. It's all inside baseball. Well, the court said, come on, get real. This is an IRS audit. There's a whole lot of public interest in what the IRS does, and it overruled the IRS and ordered the disclosure of the information. Now, if you're interested in knowing about the IRS's auditing manual, I would suggest you contact Mr. Hawks' law firm and pay for a copy, rather than simply requesting a copy of the manual from the IRS. And if you think about it, there's a good reason. Do you want to be on record as having asked the IRS for information about auditing, drawing their attention to you and your tax returns? You don't want to paint a big bullseye on your forehead. Exemption 3, matters exempt by statute. Once you send in your income tax forms, it's exempt from disclosure. Now, we are in the silly season. Now, we're going to have a presidential election next year, and candidates often release their tax returns. That's completely voluntary on the part of the candidate. There is nothing in FOIA that requires the IRS to give you a copy of Hillary Clinton's or Donald Trump's tax returns. Another example would be completed census forms. Once they're filled out, they are exempt from disclosure. And of course, CIA operations, which are exempt from disclosure under one of the National Security Acts.